Hello, everyone. Welcome to Commsverse. This session, the UC Voice Dilemma, what you didn't think about, is presented to you by Brian Ricks. Brian, take it away.
Thank Luke, appreciate it. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. As mentioned, Brian Ricks. Today we're talking about UC Voice and something that should be on the top of mind of everyone, session 142. We're going to start with a thanks to all of our sponsors, all those that are giving the information and the money to make this happen. Very important. Otherwise, none of us would be here. So that's a good thing. So make sure you stop by booths, go virtual within the team's channels, give congratulations, thanks, questions, get your information. Everybody there is looking forward to seeing you. Okay. So with that, we're going to start with voice in Teams. So voice itself is not something that is odd to a lot of people, but it is also two form factors. And I think those two form factors are things that are not often separated. It's ubiquitous that it exists, but the actual delineation is kind of blurred. So when we think of voice in meetings, we have voice when we're doing meetings like this, right? We're speaking. We have peer-to-peer and even multi-person chat when we're just within our meetings. We're talking, we're giving information, and even mobility, right? So when you're looking at your cell phone, you're not even using cellular minutes for voice. Instead, we can do voice over IP directly into our voice and give that kind of communication, but that's not really what we're talking about, right? What we're talking about is enterprise voice. UC enterprise voice is different than just voice content. Enterprise voice is when we are communicating externally with people. We are actually calling that Domino's number or that grocery store that you want to get a hold of. We want to call whatever. There's an actual number outside of our organization. We have because we do, you're calling your mom, you're calling your father, your brother, your sister, you're calling them, and because you're at work or you're at your computer in your work environment, you're utilizing the Teams voice system, and in order to reach them, it's a phone number. Now, mine aside, my mother is actually on my enterprise system, so she's an exception, but majority of people, that is exactly how it would be done. It would be calling a number, phoning a friend, right? You're calling somebody's cell phone. Again, the cell phone can be a little bit tricky because that could be a UC cell phone, but we're talking about an actual telephone number. Dial-in conferencing, generally speaking, when you're calling into a bridge, you are doing enterprise voice. So enterprise voice is not voice over IP, right? Enterprise voice, while half of it potentially is, the other half is kind of the secret sauce, and that is getting out to the PSTN world. Okay, so then the question comes, great, enterprise voice. There's voice, that's the simple part that's all integrated, we're all used to, and then there's enterprise voice, and why do I care? And I guess the initial response would be, really? Is it really felt that way? And comments and things that I've either heard or seen on the internet with clients, right? Who uses phones anymore? Okay, so we're generally speaking about a newer generation when that conversation comes into play, because they are all about texting, communicating via IM, and potentially meetings and conferences that are all digital. But who uses a 10-digit phone anymore? All right. I was speaking through the progress with a client, and their senior management and the communication came back to us. Well, I guess we could do that. I really hadn't thought about enterprise voice. Really, that's crazy. That's actually communication 101. And then more recently seen that the thought was, I guess it would be sensible to integrate the phone systems. But the thing is, it's way more than that. We're not talking about sensibility, could be, maybe it's a good idea. This is something that is the key communication to our species, is voice. Being able to communicate with someone at any point, at any time, in any way. And if you leave enterprise voice out of those modality listings, you've left out a huge gap. So it shouldn't be something that's optional. It may be later on in the process, and we'll go through that. But it definitely needs to be something that is on the timeline in an immediate future and not something that is in the distant, well, maybe we'll get to it. Okay, so we're talking about that. We're talking about how do we go about looking at the approach that we would take. And certainly the biggest thing we need to consider is, what is the current state? How is Enterprise voice use today. What vendors are in play? Are we a Cisco shop and a Avaya shop? Are we already a Microsoft shop? Do things work like we would expect from a voice? Because right, it doesn't have to be UC integrated. It can be completely a non-voice over IP PBX. And yes, they still do exist. And yes, we still do migrate from those phone systems. So it can be a standalone old PBX. It could be a Citrix-based PBX. It could be something that's just POTS lines within the location because it's a small 50, 100-person place that has very limited use of phones in their day-to-day, or that is the assumption. But as we get into things, we see, oh, it's way bigger than we thought it was, right? And then trying to figure out what their current state is of what is voice. So like the small places, well, they don't use voice a lot, perhaps, but UC is more than just voice because UC enterprise voice includes things and functions when we integrate, such as analog devices, right? Your faxing, your credit card machines, anything that has a POTS line or is going over the public switch network, that is going to be something we need to take into consideration. So really it's figuring out what business critical apps require quote unquote voice. It could be data, like in the sense of a fax machine, but it's still going over voice lines and trying to figure out exactly what it is we're doing. Once we know what the current state is, what is the environment that the voice is integrated into today, we get into the concepts of what is the project sponsor, whoever is sponsoring this whole UC movement, what are their physical requirements? And kicking it off and rolling back to, again, at the beginning, is that discussion even been had? And when it is had, hopefully there's a better response than, hadn't even thought about it. But enterprise voice needs to be discussed. And once it is, figure out what the features of the company or the enterprise are looking at. So are they desired to have nothing on premises? Is the goal to be as little as possible, but it's okay to have some on premises? Or, and there are those out there where they can say cloud just isn't a solution for us today because of XYZ, and that XY could be legitimate or it could be within the business culture. It really doesn't make too big of a difference. If in fact you're there to support the client and they understand the pros and cons, then it is possible that the cloud is not something for them today. And if that's the case, we need to know that because that's going to drive what our options and our choices are. So, okay, so no, that did not, there. Our options and our choices. Now, when we go through options and choices, we have to think about a couple of things. Again, we're relying back on what the current state is and what the desired state is, but we also have to think about a little bit further down the road. Again, is it something that is going to be 1 year, six months, 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, 10 year, right? Where is this plan of what the company is currently doing? So if they have a third-party telephone system today, and they are either tied into this phone system for some reason, or they just renewed maintenance, or it's a new purchase that isn't off the books yet. I mean, there's a multiple reasons of why we don't mess with a phone system that exists today. Then we need to take that into consideration and potentially try to tie that solution in. It really depends on what it is that they're utilizing and at what point. But there's no solution that exists today that can't have some integration into our UC world. There are companies that are still on Skype for Business. I know that is not something people want to hear, but that exists. That's all on-prem. Some that are Skype for Business still that are online and have not jumped to the Teams platform. There is the hybrid environment of OPCH or CCE that exists within environments today. I have very large numbers. And then we have the newer technologies of, do we just do direct routing or Teams calling plans, right? So those are the various options and choices we have. Do nothing and keep on a third party. We're already on a UC solution in the Microsoft world, which would be considered pre-Teams, and then we have the current Teams environment. Okay, so third-party solutions. We'll just say we're not going to talk about that today. But if you're on a third-party solution and you're not going to get off it, well, again, there are options of what we can get into. Most of these will require some sort of third-party integration of session border controllers, but boo, we're not moving there. Okay, next, Skype for Business on premises. Now, there are a lot of people that say that's a bad, dirty word. 2019, 2015, Link 2030. We really don't care. The concept is you host your UC solution on premises. There's multiple reasons that companies require or have gone the route of on-premise solutions. We have school districts that do not have public internet that can get them to the point of where they could host things in the cloud. We have government solutions that require things to be centralized and brought into a silo. We have locations that are mining that have no ability to get things into their facilities because their network is changing dramatically all the time. So if things aren't under their control, the cloud, then there's no ability for them to get the solution to their end users. So there's multiple reasons that it is the cloud will not work, and it needs to be legitimately discussed for sure. I mean, if they say it's not, understand it. Again, we don't want to pressure, but we want to understand. And then, of course, if anything that's on premise means that you have the people, the requirements, and the hardware. And the hardware we'll come back to, but what are your desktop and conference phones today? Then we get to Skype for Business Online. Obviously, we know this is ending, right? This is coming to end of life in 2021. That's not very far from now. Hey, we got a year to go. And really, SFBO is just Skype on premise in the cloud. It's the same, more or less, bits that are put up to simplify things and managed by Microsoft. So if the solution was that you were on-prem, you went to the cloud, or even you just started Skype for Business in the cloud, your conferencing and desk phones that tie to those solutions today are something to consider. Skype for Business OPCH, right? Your hybrid solutions. Obviously, without on-prem, there is no hybrid, so that is a consideration. This more or less has a one-year lifespan as well. It is more complex, but you have, again, phones that are a consideration. Hardware will continually come back here as a play into what's going on. CCE. CCE was an interesting solution that gained a lot of momentum in my world in the last couple of years as people prepped to get equipment ready for the Microsoft Teams environment. And that's interesting because CCE in and of itself is an SBC, right? A pizza box, if they're going the actual vendor route, that has a virtual machine on a chip with a lot of power. That means that these powerful computers, when they're no longer doing CCE, are still powerful computers that exist. It allowed us to position where we could have virtual machines like domain controllers, as an example, located wherever these CCE were post Skype for Business. So you're able to reutilize and take on that hardware and that expense, and all of a sudden, all of your capital expense, your CapEx, isn't thrown away, it's utilized over and over. But again, conference and desktop phones comes back up as a recurring theme. Okay, then we get total cloud-based. Now we're going just to the Teams direct routing, right? As mentioned, we were able to utilize potentially the SBCs that were in play for the Skype environment. Now there were stuff from large vendors that were utilized that were not supported or are not supported in the Teams environment today. So it's possible that you have session border controllers. It's also possible that way back when we used to even encourage people to go with ITSPs or Internet Telephone Service Providers to provide their SIP trunks direct to the mediation server of Skype. That allowed you to bypass session border controllers altogether. Now, we kind of changed focus on that in about the Link 2013 in time frame, more or less, because of the flexibility that was lost when you went direct versus going to a session border controller, and arguably the security that was lost. So most, that at least new builds, definitely had SBCs in place, but there were those that did not. So it's very possible you're coming from an on-prem solution that you did not have an SBC and now you'll need one. But there are all kinds of flavors of SBCs and all kinds of vendors that are willing to help you out here in this conference to discuss whether they be virtualized and where they're virtualized or physically and what makes sense. But those are the actual hardware that we utilize. We get back to desk phones and Carriers with direct routing is the great that we just leave them where they are, right? The whole purpose, we're not getting into what is direct routing, but obviously if you're direct routing, you don't need to mess with any of your carrier, which makes migrations safe. One at a time DIDs, nothing's changing at the carrier level. You're in control of the entire experience. Being in control is always a great thing, in my opinion. And then calling plans. Now, calling plans themselves, Microsoft Teams calling plans are definitely not something that is for everyone. Not for a lot of people, but they do provide the ability to kind of turnkey, plug and play, turn things on, and you just have enterprise voice in your environment. Doing so, beyond everything else, is the guarantee that it will work. The phone numbers will work. There is no issue of features and new functionality in the Microsoft world that will not work. However, you do deal with the porting. It's typically not an issue on the Microsoft side where we run into issues, but keep in mind when you're porting phone numbers, a carrier is losing business, and when that happens, they are not incentivized to move or do things necessarily fast or correctly. So it is just an extra complication that exists in the Teams calling plan world that doesn't exist in the direct routing world, but it is an option and it is appropriate for some organizations. It just depends on what it is you're looking for and going from there. So that's another option and opportunity. Okay. So hardware. We continually brought this up, right? And most of our slides said, hey, don't forget your hardware side. So it is the most ironic and troubling comments that are received almost indefinitely from all clients that are looking to go to Microsoft Teams that have been on a pre-Microsoft UC solution or utilizing a voice over IP solution from another vendor. Their main desire is, what about my phones? Whether it is, do I need to buy new phones? Do I need to go to headsets? Do I need to do X, Y, Z? And there is a distinct requirement that people understand that the hardware that was used in the Skype world is not the same hardware that is used in the Teams world. It's different communications, right? We're talking SIP versus HTTPS and REST, and the different ways communications happen between the two protocols, and it becomes an issue. So 3 PIP phones. So we'll start with LPE. So the Link Phone Edition phones. You would be amazed how many companies still rely on Link Phone Edition. Old LPE phones that haven't been updated for years, their firmware, yet they still function and run against an on-premise Skype for Business solution. That's great and fine. None of that has any option to work within our Teams cloud environment, so they're trash. Now, that's the worst thing that you can say to anybody is, oh yeah, those old phones, throw them away. Or you can maybe go to eBay or some other online auctioning service and see if somebody else will buy them, but keep in mind, they're gonna have the same problem you do. So really that investment is trash. And that is just something, again, it doesn't go over well, but it's a reality and a life experience. 3 PIP phones or any third-party IP phones, they exist and they existed for a long time in the Skype world to compete with the LPE hardware. And those 3 PIP phones have the ability, a large number of them, to work with the Teams world. Now that works through a gateway. It's a SIP gateway that's in the cloud, and that has a retirement date of July 2023. So while it's not a forever date, right, it is at least 3 more years that we have to utilize those phones. The biggest gotcha there is, think of it as a phone with a Band-Aid. Sure, you can log in and sure, things will function, but your actual functionality is extremely limited. So I've included the links to look at what you can and can't if there's a question that you have. What is it? What can you get? What can't you get? Majority of think of it as the phone will log in, it'll make calls, you can do minor transfers and communication, but the majority of stuff just isn't going to work on a 3 PIP phone that is an old Skype phone. Then we have our first gen Teams phones. Majority of those were Skype and Teams capable, so there was different firmwares. They worked okay on the Skype world and arguably quite well, a little slow when we were coming into the Teams world, and now we have the G2 stuff. Some of the features that are that exist that are up and coming or are brand new, like Better Together over Ethernet is an example, may or may not function on those G1 phones. As such, we're back to where we're buying new hardware if we just bought it within the last couple of years, potentially for the Teams environment to get the full functionality. So physical phones and that transition is definitely something that comes up into discussion. Conference phones are the same thing. And no, you cannot use a large voice over IP vendor's phones with the Microsoft solution and get all of the Teams functionality within it. So that's something that has to be considered as part of our planning, right? Headsets is another thing. So the argument comes, if I can hook up a headset to my Microsoft computer and it sees it as a microphone and a headset, why can't I use that same device when I'm using it within the Teams environment? Same comments that we had in the Skype world. And the basic answer is you can. You definitely can if it's okay to have reduced quality and if it's a camera, the visibility and the things just don't want to work as well as you want it to. Sure, use what you want. But if the goal is to have high quality and high functionality within your headsets, similar to the handsets, well, then they need to be certified Teams devices or Skype devices if we're going to stay on one of the Skype backends. The Skype hardware has different codec perspectives than the newer Teams environments, so the quality is only better with Teams, and there's little buttons and things of that nature. It really depends on the features you're looking for within your headsets, the quality you're looking for, and of course there's costs involved. Hardware with regards to room systems, when we're going to move off of our enterprise system, whatever it happened to be on. If we're on a room system, we're assuming we're either on Skype or we're on Teams. So if we're migrating, we're on Skype. So we had a Skype room system v2 to Teams. The nice thing is this is probably the best and the of all things that could happen, right? Skype room systems have the ability to be Skype only, Skype's first, Teams only, Teams first, Skype as a backup. And by having that combination and that flexibility, the same hardware is utilized in the whole migration path for as long as we need it to happen. Session border controllers may or may not be qualified, as we mentioned, and that's something that will be needed to be analyzed and looked at. And then analog. Analog is always overlooked whenever we're in projects. It's the phones and the analog. There's so many things that are using analog communications within businesses today, whether they realize it or not. The irony being the number one that's coming off their traditional or their voice over IP systems are credit card machines. Your credit card machine's plugged in, it's dialing up, it's making communication every time you charge a card. Granted, much older machines, newer ones today may just run over pure internet, but keep all of that in mind. I mean, it's everything needs to look at. At higher ed, it's your blue phones or your emergency phones that are throughout campus. It may be your communication from your elevators, right? When you get an elevator and you push a button, it could be your door system so that when you come up to your front door and you push a button, it's actually taking and ringing a phone off hook. There's things that are used throughout the system. Maybe they're already voice over IP enabled, maybe they're not, but they're all the things that are going to have to be looked at and considered when we're looking to move yourself and your entire enterprise voice solution to unified communications or UC. Okay. With all of that and all of those physical pieces and all of the timing and effort to get there, just so that we can get our enterprise voice in, there's always the licensing piece. Now, licensing is interesting because I'm not getting into that here, but there is licensing. There's one-time charges, monthly recurring charges. There's things that happen on all of the platforms. So it's all needs to be taken in consideration as pros and cons and where we're going and figuring that in. But there's not enough time to even begin talking about licensing because, and we'll move on from that. Okay, then we get into voice features. The biggest gotcha that we run into when we are brought into enterprise voice migrations that have already taken place is a client that says, hey, I can't do X anymore. And it's didn't we plan or test or look and see what we could or could not do prior to this migration? And the majority of the time, the assumption was, well, it worked in Skype, why doesn't it work in Teams? Or it worked in Avaya, why can't we do it here? Or so on and so forth. Things just go on and on. Enterprise voice is very simple to break down if you take it to the basics. What do we do today? What do we use today? And can we do that on project or planet or platform Y, right? So what are your requirements? Do you have call centers today and applications today? And if you do those manufacturers make something similar or exact? I mean, it can happen that will plug directly into the Teams or the online environment. If not, is there a different vendor you're willing to go with? What are your current contracts? Do things make sense to kind of analyze the actual environment and potentially break off just the call center into a different solution today? What is it that we're using it for, and how important is that solution? We also run into, again, the analog. Are there things that cannot be done except via analog, and can we somehow get that solution some other way? Getting down to our optional method. Can we run ATAs out of our SPCs or connected? Is there some way that we can convert something to make it work still, or is that application or functionality or hardware just simply not going to work, and we'll need to have some other solution? We're not going to be able to get completely there. Call flows. Right, so whenever we're talking about IVRs, call center apps, that can fall into a call center. It also can fall into just basically, I call a phone, I want it to say, thanks for calling ABC company, into the extension of the person you're trying to dial. That idea, right? That immediate auto attendant. Sometimes, and we had this whole discussion the entire time within Skype as well, sometimes it makes sense to figure out what is it you're trying to do, and is there another way to do it? So an optional method. So you're doing A today, can we just do B and C and get the same result? Granted, it's not the same method, and it may be viewed even a little cumbersome. It may be more efficient. I mean, there's different opportunities that exist. They simply need to be analyzed, and just because the system may not do it today, one of two things. One, is it doing it tomorrow? What's on the roadmap? And two, just because it can't, is that a good reason to avoid the system altogether? And generally speaking, it is not. Generally speaking, there is something that we can do to make things work better. We just have to figure out what it is that they're actually trying to do. So when a company comes, we generally want to get a flow chart out. All right, we start with our flow and say, what is the call flow today? And then at the end of the day, can I get you the same end result? And if so, is that functional? Does that make everybody happy and we move along? So that's looking at our optional methods. And if not, we get to our compromise. So I can't do what you do today, but I can do X, Y, or Z. Is that good enough? How much power does the sponsor have, right? Our project sponsor, who are they, and how badly do they want us to get to the cloud or to a new voice over IP solution? So if we're trying to get to Teams and we can't do something, does it really matter? So yes, you're right, your system does this, we can't do that. Does it really matter? And those kind of discussions need to just be heartfelt and talked about and go from there. And so I included a link that everybody can go look at. My an MVP, Luca Vitali, Italy, as I recall, has this great spreadsheet that is up and available on the TechNet Gallery that shows the basically a feature comparison of all of the Microsoft solutions on-prem as well as the cloud. What features exist in one and potentially not the other, or all along, right? So it's a green, yellow, red type of solution box. It's updated to pre-COVID, so things have actually changed since, but it's a great way to start. And I would, regardless of what you do, you're going to have to go find out this stuff yourself and test things and validate things and make sure that the functionality is there for what you're looking for, regardless of the spreadsheet you're looking at, because things do change rapidly. So again, it's a great starting point, and I would highly recommend looking at it, if for no other reason, to go, wow, I didn't even realize there were all those functions and features that were within the environment today. And anyway, it's a starting point. So again, go ahead and look at that link and we'll go from there. Migration versus new. Now, if you are starting with a Microsoft solution, arguably, and you're already in enterprise voice, it is a much tougher road to get to Teams than if you were not in a UC solution and you were moving. That being Skype for Business on-prem versus something else on-prem. And the reason is the biggest, most, at least obvious to myself, issue is that enterprise voice is tied directly to chat. So as long as you want to have your UC solution, your enterprise voice solution in your UC, and you have it today, that's going to be in Skype till the very end. But that also means your integrated chat, other than chat within channels and whatnot, will be within the older Skype for Business application. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but there's all kinds of issues and pushback. And so all of that has to come back to figuring out from a migration perspective, pilot and migrate small batches, and then migrate. And once we got all of our functionality and features figured out, we're going to migrate based off phasing in hardware, right? This location's getting new hardware, new desktop phones, new headsets. When they get the new hardware, they move to Teams. Or is it departmental based? It may not be something that we care from a physical location perspective, but this department may be spread across multi-geo zones. That's fine. We're going to do all of accounting at the same time. We're going to do all of HR at the same time. Something of that approach. But trying to group them together and keep those groups that deal with one another moving and migrating together, no different than any other SFB migration that we would potentially do or Teams migration that we would do. But enterprise voice is just as highly complex, especially when you're moving from a Skype world. And we're utilizing all of the upgrade modalities, right? So we're Skype for Business with collaboration. Then we move you to the meetings mode. And the very last piece is we switch you to full Teams only mode. And when that happens, your Skype client no longer does your telephone. And instead, everything is ready and in the cloud. So we've got to be ready for that. Now, again, with a third party's team migration, so we're going from a Cisco or Avaya or other third-party phone system, it becomes much easier because we can actually disable enterprise voice and bring your chat and everything functionally. You can be in Teams only mode and just from a policy perspective, disable enterprise voice. And so once we're ready to move a user over, whether that be through Teams direct routing or through a calling plan and we've migrated their DIDs over, whatever the case may be, we can do it all based off a phased approach, similar to what we're doing in the SFB to Teams world. But the big difference is we can get 99% functionality, right? It's only that last bit, the enterprise voice. And that's often where we see clients that forget about enterprise voice because it is separate today and it's in another silo, and so there's no impact. When you're in Skype, there's impact, and so we're moving everything and people realize it's all in the UC world and we're all going together. It can just be a little bit more cumbersome. The last thing to think about when we're doing these voice migrations, and forgotten way too often, right, is your support impact. Now, just because you put everything into Microsoft Online doesn't mean your support goes away and everything's just like, well, we got everybody in the cloud, we're good to go, yay. No, it doesn't work that way, right? So there's still support that both you utilize, whether it's because you have some hardware on-prem, right? We have things that exist from an SBC perspective that have to be maintained, have to be upgraded, the networking interoptions and the integrations and everything that goes along with making sure that the Teams experience is good. You've got that side of things. In addition, you have the end user support that will always be there indefinitely, forever. And so as the Teams application continually evolves is the best way to say it, and more functions and features, more and more support, that just is a rolling ball forever, right? You never get rid of that end user support level, and so that will be there. Full-time employees, FTEs, may or may not be impacted. You may say, I can get rid of some. You actually may be increasing your FTEs. You will find that with the evolution and the ability and the need to do change management and how we're impacting the end users based off process X, Y, and Z that we've implemented, and as Microsoft changes and evolves the product, that may no longer fit quite as we would expect or want. And so we're going to have to be able to be on top of that and keep things in check that way. And then the idea that, well, can get rid of all my FTEs, I can get rid of all my online support, I will just outsource all of my work to this consulting group or to this outsourced group. Just keep in mind, not everyone knows everything. Just because you were a company that was an expert in application X doesn't make you an expert in application Y. And I would argue, ever so kindly, that enterprise voice is one of those kind of cultures that is not very well known by a lot of individuals. And so making sure we're selecting a company that can do everything is highly key. So its support is impacted. And that is the biggest, I guess, comment or relation to this is just because we think we've done everything and we've prepared for everything and we've moved everything to the cloud, that does not eliminate the requirement to continue good support to the end users, because if the product will fail and things will just fall on its face if we don't support it end to end, right? All right, so as a wrap up to my session of what we're doing. Here, there is a breakout session that's listed here, breakout 142, as an interesting kind of side. Right after this presentation, I'm going to be in the AMA, and that Ask It Me Anything environment that starts immediately after. So I won't be in the break room for that long, but I will come back. So I will go in, I will let everybody know if you are in there, hey, come back in just a little bit. But please, if you have follow-up, you have specific questions, you have how-tos, all of those kind of questions, the break room is the place to go for this session. And of course, there's feedback. All the feedback for this session and all other sessions, we really looking forward to it. So please take the time to do so. And I will again remind you to visit all of the sponsors and their booths, and the virtual environment is amazing. If you have the virtual hardware, great. If you don't, it's okay. You can just join with a Windows machine, move around, talk to people, really get into the environment and see where things are at. Okay, and with that, I will see if there's any existing questions that need to be asked, and if not, we will wrap it up here and I will get ready for my AMA.
Thanks, Brian. We do have one question from Thomas. The question is, we are moving our direct routing from our on-prem SBCs to virtual hosted SBCs. This removes our on-prem hardware and should help with call quality. Anything for us to consider that we may not have thought about?
So the biggest, when we're moving anything to the cloud, it doesn't really matter if it is something that is hosted by yourself or something that is third party, right? So are we doing cloud hosting or are we going elsewhere? Your biggest gotcha is the generally latency, right? Which should be better as mentioned, but the control and physically, do we have as pure of the access of what we would want or have if we were something that was in our possession? So there's no real gotchas, I guess, to consider other than it's going to be one more thing that is in the cloud, and assuming that you can get to the cloud, then everything should work. If you can't, then things wouldn't. So we're kind of, so no, I mean, it shouldn't be a big deal. And to your point, it should in theory be better. Test. So.
Thanks for that, Brian. Well, that will wrap up this session. Keep in mind, if you want to chat with Brian following this one, there is a link in the announcement section of the Q&A. That's the top link related to the UC voice dilemma. Brian has just a couple of minutes there. And if you do have any other questions, feel free to join his Ask Me Anything with other industry experts at the link at the bottom of the Q&A. With that, thank you again for attending. We'll leave this open for another about 2 minutes. Have a great day.
Thank you.